tell you a quick story about Dylan.
Dylan helped me when renewal hit. Like, you know, remember when renewal hit, there was a lot of manifestations, right? People shaking, and there was a lot of power, right? People were shaking and doing all this kind of stuff. I was playing with a worship artist named Brian Dirksen, who's written some of the most lovely, you know, sweet, gentle worship music. And this is when renewal first hit. And I was in a worship service. This is weeks after renewal hit. And all of a sudden, in the congregation, all of this shaking started going on. And do you remember the holy chaos of those days? And I'm sitting on stage and I'm playing, and Brian's standing at the microphone, and I'm sitting at the keyboard and I'm looking around. Sorry, I'll stay in one place. And I'm going, this is really ticking me off. I'm really not liking this. And I finally got so upset that I stood up from the piano mid-song, walked across the stage with my back to the audience, turned to Brian, my back to the audience, and I said, "This is a bunch of crap," and walked off stage and sat in the stairwell and cried my eyes out, because I said to God, how dare you? How dare you make your people do the very thing I've been praying that my child stops doing? Because at the time, Dylan was shaking uncontrollably. That was one of the things that manifest his disability. And I was praying over him for years, Lord, make him stop doing that. He's hurting himself. It's not good. And then all of a sudden I see God move and touch people, and they're shaking. How dare you, God? And God said, he just gently said to me, stop looking at the manifestations and start seeing me. And I thought he meant that as it related to renewal. But he meant that as it related to Dylan. Yeah. And when I stopped seeing my son do this, I finally saw the Jesus in my little boy. And I owe that little boy a lot of my life, because if it wasn't for him and his condition, who's, by the way, been fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and doesn't need to be healed because he's not sick. Am I stepping on toes?
On my toes.
If it wasn't for him, I probably wouldn't have the heart for the Father that I have. And I wouldn't have learned the lessons of worship without expectation, loving without the reciprocal response. He's a blessing, that little kid. Big kid now, he's 18. It's a lot of work. But he doesn't doubt. And that's probably, if I can give you one thing at this point today, it would be try to remove doubt from your paradigm. Try to remove the notion that music is the only form of worship. Stop calling it, this is our worship time. Stop calling it a worship service. Today's worship, I think we worship when we sleep. You know, to be honest with you, I think worship goes way beyond action. I think worship, you know, you could just sit. How many of you, you know, look, we say too much and we do too much. We're human beings, not human doings. I love the times when I can sit in the car with my wife and drive for hours and nothing's being said. We're not necessarily even holding hands, but the sense of God, of the love that we have for one another, is really manifest in that car. But nothing's being said, nothing's being done. There's no activity. We're just in one another's presence, and that's enough. And I could say to her, honey, I love you. And I could look at her and there'll be a smile on her face, and she doesn't need to say it back. But the smile on her face is enough. I mean, when you worship, why don't you look at your Father's face and see the delight in His face as you worship Him? That's powerful. That's the money, is the delight in His face when we worship Him. Is this okay?
Good.
You guys all right?
Yeah.
You're not mad at me? No, let's keep working at that. Does this make sense? Does anybody have anything to say or wanna? Yeah.
Real quick, coming from 5 years, I went from being in an environment where, you know, have been in renewal, have, you know, spent time in Toronto, and I went and pastored a church for 5 years, a congregational church, and went from being very comfortable with what you're just talking about, loving that form of worship, and actually, my wife probably struggled harder with it, back to this, what we would call liturgical style, but God really taught me in the process about what you just were saying. It's not about the music. Even when you know, you can worship God in a lot of different ways, and one of the things you spoke to my heart was the truest form of worship is a surrendered life.
Yes.
And but it just is an interesting perspective, because we do get comfortable, you know, and we do.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden now you end up in this other, and now it's, okay, I've got to find God now in this process.
Yeah.
You know, and it's rich when you do, you know, when you're just in that place.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Gosh, yeah.
I just feel like you just exposed an idol in my heart.
An idol?
Yeah. Because it's like we're worshiping worship, and we want something in return, and it's an idol. It's not the Lord, because if it's for Him, it's Him,
Exactly.
only Him. And it's like what you were saying about your son. It's Him. It's just Him.
That's it.
You know. And so it blessed me because it exposed an idol. It's an idol of our hearts, and it's almost as if, where you were speaking, I could just feel the Father being jealous, you know, over, you know, you're sharing your heart with that, not me. So, thank you.
I've had a problem with that for a long time, saying to, they come out and say, hey, thank you for leading us into God's presence. I thought, you know, God's presence was within us. So as soon as we showed up, there it is. But the next phase was, you know, when Jesus said to that woman at the well, that's one of my favorite stories. He said to her, God's looking for those who worship the Spirit of truth. And she went down to the town that saved. But at the same time, nobody sung a song. Jesus didn't do a dance. Nothing happened. So I said, well, what is true worship? Witnessing. That ended up my default.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
See, that just was exposed to me.
Yeah.
So to me, true worship was always witnessing. So if you're not witnessing, you're not worshiping. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Hold the phone.
Sure.
I just point that out.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You will?
Not that we shouldn't witness.
Yeah. No. Not that we
Not
shouldn't sing.
a song.
That's right. This isn't about. It's not.
Right.
They're not mutually exclusive. I'm not
Right.
saying let's eliminate music, and
Right.
I'm not saying all of that. But what David said is probably true. We have kind of idolized some of these elements,
Absolutely.
and they become, you know, again, what's in it for me?
That's right.
And that just seems really, really strange in light of the God of creation who courses through my veins. I just adore him. I love him. I mean, I love him. I'd like to think that my sense of worship is evident when I go to the restaurant or when I go shopping.